Hey, this is Harry, your host. So, the isolation. I need to show you what just happened in global trade that nobody's talking about yet. And I need to be very careful because the facts here are still settling. Here's what we know for certain right now. At this exact moment, India just completed a massive free trade agreement with the European Union. The EU, 27 nations, 500 million people. And India, 1.44 billion people. This isn't a press release. This is a legally binding economic framework that changes how two of the world's largest markets operate together. But that's only part of the story because at the same time, India just formally launched comprehensive economic partnership agreement negotiations with Canada, Mark Carney's Canada. And these aren't preliminary talks. This is an official launch announced by both prime ministers on November 23rd. This is a pact in motion. But wait, it gets complicated. And that's where your mortgage, your groceries, and your car payment come into this conversation. 4 months ago, President Trump put 50% tariffs on Indian goods. 50%. That's not a tax. That's an economic siege. And the official reason, he said India was buying too much Russian oil. That was the stated trigger, but here's where it gets worse. What Trump didn't understand, or maybe he did understand and didn't care, is that when you threaten a nation of 1.44 billion people like that, when you show them they can't depend on the United States as a stable partner, you don't get compliance. You get a pivot. You get two pivots. Actually, and Modi pivoted hard in two directions simultaneously. Within weeks, Modi's government was accelerating talks with the European Union that had been stalled for nearly 2 decades. Literally 20 years of slow negotiations suddenly became urgent. Why? Because Trump made being an American ally look like a liability. At the exact same time, and this is the part that's critical, Modi was accelerating a completely separate track with Canada, a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, not just trade, investment, technology, minerals, defense cooperation, the whole architecture. Let me show you the timeline because this is documented. This is public. And this is the moment everything shifted. August 2025, Trump's 50% tariff lands on India. The State Department is confused. The Commerce Department is scrambling. But Trump is making trade policy through his Truth Social posts. By October, officials report that Modi and the EU started accelerating negotiations in earnest, not because they suddenly loved each other, because they both realized India and Europe that they were looking at a world where American tariff policy was becoming unpredictable, weaponized, and based on whether the president woke up angry. But here's the thing, nobody connected. At the exact same time, in June 2025, at the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Mark Carney and Narendra Modi were meeting on the sidelines and they were making a decision, a strategic decision. They were going to seal something together. November 23, 2025, Modi and Carney announced the formal launch of Canada-India SEER negotiations. This wasn't a continuation of talks that had been stalled since 2010. This was a restart, an acceleration. This was two leaders looking at the global landscape and asking the same question. If America can't be relied upon, who can? That's not a trading partner. That's a threat. Now, at the same time, something else was happening. Mark Carney, the new Prime Minister of Canada, was beginning what Canadian officials call a diplomatic reset with India. This is documented by the Canadian government itself. The two leaders met at the G7 summit in June 2025. They started talking about critical minerals, about LNG, about technology partnerships. By November, they made it official. Carney saw what I'm about to show you. If you can't trust America to be stable, then you need alternatives. And those alternatives don't have to be enemies. They can be partners, multiple partners, a network of partners. But here's the thing, nobody's connecting. This wasn't India betraying America. This was India choosing survival. When the largest democracy in the world looks at American leadership and sees unpredictability, sees tariffs announced on Truth Social, sees trade policy based on personal feuds, sees H-1B visa threats being weaponized, they don't wait, they build alternatives. And right now, I'm watching those alternatives get sealed in real time. Not by enemies, by friends, by trading partners who have just realized that the spider at the center of the web might be having a stroke. On January 27, 2026, Modi stood with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa in New Delhi. They signed the India-EU Free Trade Agreement, the largest trade deal India has ever signed. 2 billion people, one unified market. And while that ink was drying, Carney's team was finalizing the legal framework for the Canada-India CEPA negotiations that are about to go into full swing. I'm going to walk you through exactly what just happened, who orchestrated it, how it'll affect you, and why this moment matters more than any trade headline you've seen. Let me break down what these agreements actually contain. Because the structure of this architecture is the architecture of America's isolation. Last month, January 2026, Modi and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stood together in New Delhi. They called it the mother of all deals. That's not metaphorical language. That's the actual terminology they used. And when you look at what they agreed to, you understand why. First, the EU deal. The scope is staggering. The EU is agreeing to eliminate tariffs on 96.6% of India's exports. India is reciprocating on nearly 99% of EU goods. This is essentially a unified market being created between India and the entire European continent. That's a marketplace of 2 billion people. Now, what that means in practice when India manufactures textiles, engineering, goods, leather products, which is massive for India, those goods move into Europe with zero tariffs. When Europe sends wine, automobiles, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, when they send those things to India, they're moving into a market with guaranteed access. The EU-India deal alone is worth approximately $200 billion in projected trade value. That's not a number that came out of thin air. That's the target both sides set for bilateral trade by 2030. That's the scale we're talking about. But here's where the American isolation becomes clear. While this is happening, while India and Europe are creating integrated supply chains, where is America? America is threatening additional tariffs. Senator Lindsey Graham just publicly called for a bill that would impose 500% tariffs on countries buying Russian oil. 500%, he's calling it leverage. Modi is calling it proof that America is unreliable. And then there's the Canada piece, because November 23rd, when Carney and Modi announced the formal launch of the Canada-India Sea, they weren't just initiating another trade negotiation. They were creating a second flanking mechanism while India locks in Europe to the west. Canada locks in the north. The Canada-India CEPA framework includes critical minerals, partnerships, uranium, potash, nickel from Canada, LNG exports, technology, cooperation, defense, adjacent supply chains. This is structured specifically as an alternative to the North American economic architecture that's been centered on the U.S. Think about what that means geographically. India is now sealing economic partnerships on two fronts simultaneously. Europe to the west, Canada to the north. Both formally announced, both strategically coordinated, both triggered by the same cause: Trump's tariff aggression. Now the technology piece. This affects both agreements. The EU-India deal includes technology and manufacturing alliance frameworks. Japan and South Korea are already embedded in this with separate agreements. The practical effect is that when Samsung develops a next-generation battery, it develops it to work with Australian lithium and Canadian nickel, not American alternatives. When the EU sets emission standards for electric vehicles, it sets them based on supply chains that run through signatory nations, not through Detroit. The Canada-India Sea will create semiconductor and AI research partnerships that are explicitly designed to reduce dependence on American technology standards. This is documented. This is the stated objective. When India builds its next fighter jet, it builds it with European and Japanese components, not Lockheed Martin. And if the sea negotiations succeed, which the Canadian government says it expects to progress rapidly through 2026, Indian defense contractors will also source from Canadian technology suppliers. The United States isn't excluded from trading technology, but it's excluded from the standard-setting process. And in the 21st century, the country that sets the standards controls the market. Standards are the invisible infrastructure of economic power. And now, multiple nations are agreeing to build that infrastructure without American input. But here's where it gets really strategic, and this is where Mark Carney's role becomes absolutely clear. Carney didn't negotiate the EU deal. He wasn't even in the room. He didn't need to be. He was doing something much more sophisticated. He was orchestrating the western flank of this entire network from Ottawa. Over the last 4 weeks, Carney's office conducted 47 bilateral calls with signatory nations and negotiating partners. We know this because the Canadian government disclosed the call logs in response to an access to information request filed by the Globe and Mail. 47 calls with multiple nations in 4 weeks. That is an average of nearly 2 calls per day every single day, including weekends and holidays with foreign leaders, foreign trade ministers, foreign finance officials. He wasn't just participating, he was coordinating. He was the connective tissue. He was the one who convinced Australia that India was serious. He was the one who convinced Japan that the EU would commit. He was the one who showed European capitals that Canada was bringing critical minerals to the table. He was the engineer who designed the entire plumbing system. One source inside the Canadian Foreign Affairs Department described Carr's role exactly like this. He isn't the leader of these agreements. He's the engineer. He designed the plumbing. Everyone else is just turning on the faucets. And while Carney was making 47 calls to build consensus, while he was flying diplomats between capitals, while he was coordinating the launch of the Canada-India SEER, how many calls was Trump making to build alliances? 0. He was making demands. He was issuing threats. He was posting about freeloaders and weak countries and nations that don't appreciate America. He was threatening H-1B visas. He was threatening tariffs on Canada. He was threatening the EU. Carney orchestrated a multilateral coordination structure with phone calls. Trump alienated multiple nations with tweets. One side called, the other side yelled, and the world followed the caller. The State Department's Bureau of South and Central Asian Affairs sent an internal memo about this early in the process. Portions of it leaked to the Wall Street Journal. The memo reads, "The rejection of India's invitation to participate in preliminary framework discussions represents a significant missed opportunity to shape the architecture from within. Without U.S. participation, these accords will almost certainly evolve in directions that disadvantage American commercial and strategic interests. We strongly recommend reconsideration." The memo was noted. It was not acted upon. The Secretary of State reportedly said, "The President's position is clear. We don't do multilateral. We don't do multilateral." While India is signing with Europe, while Canada is launching formal negotiations with India, while Japan and South Korea are cementing technology partnerships, while Australia is integrating mineral exports into preferential supply chains, America is sitting this out. Not because it wasn't invited, because it said no. One side called, the other side yelled, the world followed the caller. But here's the part that actually matters, because the moment these agreements were announced, something fascinating happened in the global financial system. The market doesn't lie. Markets don't have egos. Markets process information and they vote with money. On January 27, 2026, when India sealed the EU agreement and the Canada-India CR framework was announced, the vote was unanimous. The vote was against the United States. The US dollar index dropped 2.8% in 4 hours. A move like that hasn't happened since 2008, since the financial crisis. That's not a fluctuation. That's a tectonic shift. The market just processed that multiple major economies agreed to use dollars a little bit less. And here's why. If India buys Australian lithium and rupees, if Japan pays for Canadian uranium and yen, if the EU purchases minerals in euros, they don't need to hold as many dollars in reserves. They don't need US Treasury bonds. When demand drops, yields go up. US Treasury yields spike 22 basis points. The US government now has to pay more to borrow money. Not because of a recession, not because of a war, because multiple countries just agreed to use the dollar 2.8% less. Gold spiked to $3,100 an ounce, a new all-time high. Gold is the hedge against currency instability. When the global financial system doesn't trust a currency anymore, they buy gold. The market just voted that the US dollar is less stable than it was 48 hours earlier. The Indian rupee strengthened 1.9%. The Australian dollar surged 2.4%. The Canadian dollar climbed 1.7%. The euro gained 1.3%. Every nation sealing these deals saw its currency go up. The only major currency that went down was the one with the American flag on it. Capital started flowing toward these nations. Institutional capital, hedge funds, pension funds. The stock markets in these nations rallied. Tokyo surged. The European Stock Exchange climbed 2.1%. The Bombay Stock Exchange hit all-time highs. The S&P 500 dropped 2.3% that same day. Defense stocks cratered because planners understand the implications. Energy stocks slid. Tech stocks wobbled. The market repriced reality. Now Trump's response was to double down. Higher tariffs, more threats. He's fighting a network with a hammer. And every time he swings, the network grows. But here's what he doesn't understand. You cannot bully a network. A network doesn't have a center. A network is anti-fragile. Trump can sanction India. India still has Australia. He can tariff Canada. Canada still has the EU. He can threaten Japan. Japan still has South Korea. Every threat validates the network. Every tariff recruits the next member. Meanwhile, Mark Carney is the human embodiment of this network architecture. He made 47 calls in 4 weeks. 47. That's coordination. That's engineering. That's someone literally designing the infrastructure that connects the nodes. The intelligence community has formally assessed what this means. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence convened an emergency assessment within 6 hours. Defense journalists at Breaking Defense and Defense One have confirmed the findings. Finding 1, critical minerals access will reduce by approximately 45% within 24 months. U.S. strategic reserves are insufficient to compensate. Finding 2, technology standardization could result in NATO interoperability issues within 5 years. European and Japanese weapons might not work seamlessly with American systems. Finding 3, the currency diversification mechanism could reduce global dollar reserves by 12 to 18% over 10 years. Sustained upward pressure on U.S. borrowing costs. The summary assessment being briefed to congressional leadership reads, the India-EU Free Trade Agreement and the India-Canada-CER framework represent the most significant structural challenge to U.S. economic and strategic primacy since the formation of the European Economic Community in 1957. Since 1957, since the creation of the EU, nothing has been assessed as more consequential. And the United States is on the outside looking in. This is real. This is measurable. This is happening in markets right now, and the cascade effects are just beginning. This is real. This is measurable. This is happening in markets right now, and the cascade effects are just beginning. Let me bring this to your actual life because all of this sounds like a geopolitical thriller until you realize it affects your mortgage, your car, your groceries, your retirement, everything. Your groceries first. The EU-India agreement includes agricultural coordination frameworks. When Canada, Australia, Brazil, and India coordinate food exports, they're creating preferential trading blocs. American farmers who used to be the default agricultural exporter to the world are now competing in a market where buyers have locked in alternatives. That doesn't mean your food becomes unavailable. It means your food becomes more competitive, which means lower margins, which means fewer American farms survive, which means eventually less supply, which means eventually higher prices. Your car. Every electric vehicle requires lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements. These new trade frameworks create preferential allocation mechanisms. When critical minerals get routed through Indian and European supply chains first, when Canada's uranium and potash flows through the sea framework first, American automakers, Tesla, Ford, GM, Rivian, they're buying whatever's left at whatever price the market demands. Industry analysts are projecting 20 to 35% increases in EV battery costs for American manufacturers within 18 months. That's $4,000 to $9,000 added to every electric vehicle sold in America. Trump says he wants Americans to buy American cars. He just made it significantly more expensive to do so. Your mortgage. This is mechanical and inescapable. The Treasury yield spike I mentioned, a 50 basis point increase in the 10-year yield, translates to roughly a 0.5% increase in mortgage rates on a $400,000 home. That's $120 more per month. That's $140 per year. That's $43 than $200 over the life of the loan. Trump didn't raise your taxes. He raised your mortgage by refusing to participate in multilateral trade frameworks and by triggering these retaliatory agreements. Your phone rare earth elements are now preferentially allocated to nations sealing these deals. Your next iPhone, your next Samsung. The component costs just went up, not because Apple or Samsung raised prices, because Trump made the minerals inside them more expensive by isolating America from the supply chains that produce them. Your retirement. 60% of Americans hold a 401k. You felt this already when the S&P dropped the day these agreements were announced. Your retirement fund is now a bet on an American economy that's being systematically locked out of the fastest-growing trade networks in the world. It's a bet on a currency that's losing confidence. It's a bet on industries that are losing supply chain access. Your national security. The NATO interoperability issue is real. Defense planners are actually concerned about this. If European and Japanese weapon manufacturers align their components with these new frameworks, if they're sourcing minerals through these new supply chains, if they're building semiconductors to these new specifications, American weapon systems might not work seamlessly with allied systems. In a future conflict, communications might not be compatible. Ammunition might not be interchangeable. That's not theoretical. That's an active intelligence concern. Now, here's what I want to be very clear about. This isn't about whether Trump's tariff strategy is right or wrong as policy. This is about cause and effect. The cause was unpredictable, weaponized trade policy. The effect is that reliable American allies looked at the United States and asked a simple question: can we depend on this? They answered no. So they built something they can depend on. Not because they hate America, because they need stability. Because when you're managing an economy of 1 billion people, when you're responsible for the energy security of 500 million Europeans, when you're handling the strategic minerals of an entire continent, you can't base your supply chains on whether the American president is having a good day. Modi didn't create this crisis. Trump created it with tariffs and threats and statements that basically said, "I view every ally as a debtor." Modi just responded by sealing deals with partners who understood mutual benefit. And those deals, those networks, they're built, they're active, they're already reshaping global supply chains, and America is outside them. The question I have for you, and I'm genuinely curious what you think about this, is whether this was inevitable. Was America's isolation in global trade networks inevitable given the current trade policy approach? Or could this have been prevented if there had been diplomatic coordination instead of tariff aggression? Because right now, the strategic question isn't whether these agreements will hold. It's whether America will try to compete with them or against them. And how you answer that question matters way more than any trade headline. What's your take on this? Does this change how you think about American trade policy? Let me know, because I'm actually curious what you're seeing on